Okay, let me begin the introduction. Again, it's really a pleasure to introduce someone who just was with us as a graduate student. Lucas Drouhot is a 2018 Cornell PhD in sociology. And he comes from the my favorite wine growing district of France. And he did a degree at University of Lyon, and then went to study at McGill University, where he got a bachelor's degree in sociology. And then he came down to join us at Cornell. And what's distinctive about Lucas's career at Cornell is that he was good at everything. He was a wonderful teaching assistant in my economic sociology courses. He was a terrific graduate research assistant. We completed 2 full already published articles from that period. And he was generally involved in most of the department activity and won numerous awards for his papers that he published. He's published since. And so a Cornell PhD doing well is one we always like to think about. And so we have Lucas today, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute in the study of ethnicity and religion. And that has been a wonderful context for work. And Lucas has been the principal investigator of major survey of immigrants in Europe and a number of other projects. But I'm pleased to see that of the 6 publications that he has on his vita, all but 5 were with colleagues outside of Cornell. So 5 were begun at Cornell, and he was a long-standing and outstanding member of my lab, and several of them were presented at the lab and got good feedback. And this is I'm thinking again of his forthcoming AJS article, which he will be published, that was also begun at Cornell and presented in the lab. I can see former lab members who knew him and were there to give him feedback in the audience today. He's published also, he has 2 forthcoming articles in 2021. It's the early time to have forthcoming articles listed on the CV. The one I've already mentioned, but he has a second one, which was co-authored with Felice Gori, which is on the uncovering the heterogeneity of Asian Americans, which is coming out from Russell Sage Foundation. Again, I look forward to reading that article and learn about heterogeneity amongst the people of my ethnic group. Then there are articles published in social networks, in CSES, in Theory and Society, co-authored with me, and in the Annual Review of Sociology, which Lucas tells me is getting onto the big citation marquee. So it's been a pleasure to have worked with Lucas, and especially serving as his thesis advisor. And without saying more, again, I'm very pleased to have Lucas present his paper. And it certainly has evolved, and so I'm looking forward to hearing how it's evolved in its final days before publication. Lucas?
Okay, yep. Thank you, Victor. That was wonderful to hear. And yes, it is indeed a project which I presented multiple versions of at the lab, and you saw like multiple talks about. So you know, you'll see that it's changed, but you know the basics of this. Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay. You all see this correctly? Okay, yeah, so thanks everyone for being here. As Victor said, I appreciate taking the time, and we've all have so many Zooms and so on and so forth, so it's this is especially valuable. And yeah, so that was an article from my dissertation, which has been long in the making. I think had the first version of this more or less 4.5 years ago or something like this. And so to sort of situate what it's about, I'll just briefly sort of mention or explain what we mean by assimilation, which is of course a contentious topic in social sciences, but also in sort of everyday conversations around those issues of diversity. And here I build pretty heavily, of course, on Victor's work. I think Victor's done more than any other social scientists really to kind of rehabilitate that concept. And so here, we just mean a broad process of convergence and progressive equality between immigrants across generations and natives. And so, basically the way I think about it, and also again building on Victor's work, is the socioeconomic dimension, structural dimension, which is about mobility, a relational dimension, which is about networks and intermarriage, and a symbolic or cultural dimension, which is about cultural difference and issues of identity, which is something that's really what I'm going to be talking about today. That's something we elaborate more on this annual review article that Victor mentioned. But basically, yeah, this is this one realm which I'm focusing on today, which I would say actually in American-born theories of assimilation had received relatively little attention. And I think that has to do with the fact that the US is a settler society and there's hyphenated identities and so on and so forth. And I think bringing in the cultural dimension to the fore in assimilation theory or neo-assimilation theory is really something that I also want to do more of in the future. But that really comes from the European experience of nation states and sort of diversifying nation states with a pre-existing, rather homogeneous population and so on and so forth. So that's for the location of what I'm going to do. And the second sort of big picture contextualization is really to say that within the last, I would say, 35, 40 years, we really switched progressively from speaking around these issues of integration and diversity in ethnic terms to religious terms. And I think there's a lot of scholarship really those are the big books that have contributed to doing that, but zeroing on religion as a sort of key dimension of difference, both differentiation, but also, of course, politicization of difference and the way we define sort of, the community of us, as it were, right? And even discussions of multiculturalism, really, there's all this stuff around the backlash against multiculturalism that occurred in around 2010 or so, I would say, in political rhetoric, at least. And that's really all these discussions, and they've happened maybe more strongly so than in other place. For example, in the Netherlands as well, and in France, have really revolved around incorporation of Muslim minorities, right? So the crisis of multiculturalism is kind of coded talk for that. So that's the second aspect of the big picture contextualization. And I think it's really helpful to reframe all of these debates and those tensions around religiosity, and to rethink those tensions and those debates around the idea of a religiosity differential between the Muslim populations, which are overwhelmingly of recent immigrant origin. We have now a third generation slowly coming of age, with its large majority of first and second generation. And so it's useful to think of it as a religiosity differential, simply because when you think about the controversies that are associated with accommodating religious difference, really have to do with the fact that there's a religiosity differential. So things about specific practices like halal eating in public schools, in public canteens, and other types of religious accommodation what we often talk about as the liberal dilemma, and whether or not we should be liberal with minorities who may be illiberal in some aspects of attitudes. I mean, there's some interesting work on homosexuality attitudes, for example, among Muslim minorities in Europe. Low rates of religiously mixed marriages among the second generation. And more generally, like really interesting new work on Islamophobia, showing that it's not so much a categorical dislike, that's works coming out of Germany, as it is like a dislike of high religiosity. So in a way, we can reframe those debates and those discussions around as a way to kind of gain explanatory power on them as a religiosity differential. And well, again, here, like from the American experience, we have to, of course, take a step back and basically realize that the norm, the statistical norm in a place like France is that, religiosity levels are very low. I mean, that's an outcome of, centuries of different historical processes, but it's really sort of being sort of evacuated out of public life. And so, I have this formula, like when I think about the situation of, there's work showing that, for example, second generation individuals in the US tend to increase in religiosity, or like to believe is to belong. That's the type of like phrase I would use to summarize, I think, those different assimilation dynamics by context. And those are data from the International Social Survey Program from, I think, 2008, just plotting, simple response average scores to a question on subjective religiosity. And I think the scale runs from 1 to 10, although on top of my head, it may be slightly more constricted than that. But in any case, I mean, you see that sort of contextualized difference here pretty clearly. And that helps me to sort of define the notion of assimilation that I'm going to be using in that particular talk, is simply a sort of increasing social similarity, right? So there's no, again, just to make it clear, like there's no normative component to this. This is purely descriptive. And we expect it happens simply because, there's historical work showing that, it's happened in the past in the French case. I mean, there's work around, Jewish minorities and so on and so forth, for instance, as well as Italians who are, for first generation singled out for being too religious and so on and so forth, and were stigmatized as such, and then sort of, became secularized. So the contextualization here is that simply high religiosity is not a assimilatory or integrative force in Western Europe, but especially in France. And so the expectations for second generation is very clear, is that basically, given that it's a strong norm, children of immigrants from high religiosity context should see a kind of decay or decrease. And to a large extent, that's what we see. So that's the data that I'll be using for the rest of the talk, which is from a large scale French survey on minorities, immigrant origin minorities in France. And here I'm just plotting the immigrant native religiosity ratio for different groups. So the red bars are those who identify simply as Christian. The blue bars are those who identify as Catholics, and the green ones as those who identify as Protestants. And you see that's a kind of decay, as you would expect. So for example, for Catholics, for foreign-born immigrants who identify as Catholics are about twice as religious as natives on average, and that decay quite dramatically to about 1.5, or slightly so 1.6 perhaps amongst their children. And if you put them, the Muslim minorities, show them to pictures, I mean, what you see is fairly different. I mean, you have, first of all, much higher level, and the ratio is very different, but also you don't see that decay. If anything, it increases. And so what's motivating me in that paper is to try to account for that and explain it, where it comes from. So how do we explain this puzzle of delayed religious assimilation, and how do we do this? And that was the other motivation, is how do we do this without sort of essentializing either native populations or Muslim populations as homogeneous and irrevocably different, which I think is a real issue in research, because we've accumulated all these findings around Muslims as this or that, and how do we contribute to sort of restore heterogeneity to that. And so I'm making 3 contributions in that paper. First is providing a precise empirical description of the magnitude of that religiosity differential and its different components in terms of dimensions of religiosity. Provide a sort of explanatory model. I mean, here by explanation, it's not causal because the data I use is simply cross-sectional, but the relative weight of different hypotheses and different hypothesized mechanisms, at least, that we can capture. And finally, doing that through a sort of empirical strategy that pays attention to heterogeneity and is reflexive around those categories. And so in the rest of our talk, I'm going to first present scenarios and hypotheses that could be at work, then mention the new empirical strategy, which I proposed and implemented in the paper, which I call the inductive subgroup comparison approach, and then results and discussion. So, how do we explain that? And when I was thinking about this, I rely, of course, a lot on American literature because, to an extent, it's there's a lot out there that could be used as motivation and ways to think through these issues. But of course, also Western European literature, so a mixture of both, and for both also from literatures on issues of race as well, so not just religion. So the first hypothesis is one really, it's about poverty, basically. That would be the main story. And, there's, of course, a long tradition of work in the sociology of religion looking at this, specifically, work on modernization, right, and value change as a result of increase in living standards and so on. And the assumption here is that high religiosity is the way to cope with uncertainty in daily life, and that uncertainty comes from not knowing how to put food on the table, basically. And that's received a decent amount of support also in work in Europe. And what makes that explanation credible is that we know that Muslim minorities in Europe, but in France in particular, are fairly impoverished. And this is just a way to illustrate that with another article published a year ago where I was interested in looking at issues of segregation and sort of mapping Muslim places. And when you overlay those geolocations with data from a census on neighborhood income, you see that there's a kind of a pretty neat inverse relationship. So that basically make that kind of material insecurity hypothesis credible. Okay, so that's one potential explanation. Another one has to do with discrimination and perceived discrimination. And so here I'm taking literature mostly from the US, looking at the causal sort of impact of perception of unfair treatment on identity, and that's the rejection identification model from Branscombe and colleagues in social psychology. But we know that from survey data, we know that Muslim minorities report high level of perceived discrimination. So again, that makes it a possible explanation to account for those high levels of religiosity, especially among the second generation. Third potential mechanism has to do with transmission and parental socialization. So here it would be, more like a straightforward transmission from a context of origin, from parents from high religiosity countries. And here, the inspiration from this is mostly work that's done in other European countries, showing high rates of transmission of both affiliation but also intensity, mostly in Germany. Transnationalism is the fourth explanation, and here it's also something that's having to do with transmission from the context of origins, but not this time, not necessarily through immediate family ties, but friends and family who stayed in the country of origin. And finally, something which I took from work on Hispanic identity in identity change in the US, that has to do with the impact of recent immigrants on acculturation dynamics amongst later generation. And basically the idea here is that being in constant contact with newly arrived migrants contribute to sort of maintain the culture of a country of origin. And so in this, these ideas, can be summarized quite simply in the fact that continuous migration prevents acculturation of later generation migrants. And so here we know that spatial mobility, for example, is fairly limited, and we know that the second generation lives in neighborhoods which are very similar in composition to that of their parents, and that makes that kind of explanation, which really has to do with social influence and contact, credible. Okay, and so to summarize these hypotheses, I think we can just think of them as one set of hypotheses has to do with really sort of a cultural import as a way to explain that higher religiosity, and another one has to do with endogenous processes in the context of reception in France, right? So those are quite different ways to think about it. It's a handy way to sort of summarize them and how they differ. And in terms of empirical strategy, so here what was really motivating me was long-standing concerns for the issue of population heterogeneity, and it's something that I also picked up when minoring in anthropology, and the issue of essentialism and how we could potentially reproduce it as researchers. And I think in the context of these issues in Europe, I mean, Muslim minorities are particularly prone to that because they're heavily politicized. And so we always discuss them in public. I mean, there's actually discussion going on at this very moment. Again, today I was just reading, Le Monde in France, and there's still these issues around whether or not they can be assimilated and so on, whether or not they belong, are they irrevocably different? I mean, it's not phrased in those terms, but those are underlying concerns around, discussions of new laws and so on and so forth. And so my aim here is to sort of use one aspect of machine learning to achieve this kind of epistemological break with those categories. And that's something that's motivated from theoretical work around, it's not so much on religion, it's really about ethnicity, with people like Brubaker and Andrew Swimmer and ethnic boundaries. So that's a kind of normative concern, but there's also it's more simply analytical concern in that we may subsume very different social processes under one category. And that's something which I also picked up from Felice, who recently left the department, in her work on Mexican migrants, and so disaggregating that category in different types of migrants using data-driven methods. That was also a big inspiration for what I'm doing here. And so in that paper, I formulate what I call the inductive subgroup comparison approach, which is a way to study assimilation, not by relying on groups, but on relying on subgroups. And so it consists in 3 steps. And the first step is to look at the social structure of a native population and to identify heterogeneity within the native population. Then matching immigrants to like socially proximate subgroups. And finally, modeling, in that case, religiosity, but it can be any outcome, continuous outcome of interest, as is within subgroup process. And just to illustrate, and I won't get into the specifics, technicalities, although I could in the Q&A if it's of interest. So that's the sort of nominal group approach that I think is very dominant. And people have been talking about this for a long time. I mean, like there's, I was thinking about David Fitzgerald's idea of ethno-racial Olympics and how we pit groups against one another. And in that very process, we sort of essentialize ethnic groups as a natural unit of analysis. So it could be that, or in my case, religious groups. But the nominal group approach is to simply compare, taking for granted those categories and letting them organize the way you approach the data. And what my approach does is basically to divide things up and to look at specific subgroups. So of course, you still have a traditional native immigrant comparison, which are the black arrows here, but that opens up the way for within group comparison. And so that's also something that but at the heart of something like a segmented assimilation as well, for example, this idea of intragroup heterogeneity. But it's never been fully operationalized empirically, I think, up until now. And so here we compare, again, to be clear, we compare immigrants and natives, but we compare those pathways across the subgroups making up immigrants as well. And so those are the orange linkages below. If anything isn't clear, feel free to ask questions, or maybe, hopefully it's clear enough to follow for now. I'm happy to clarify some of the details in the Q&A if some questions arise. But some now matters of definition and how we operationalize things. So I use data from the survey that all of us use, because it's really high quality, but what's the only high quality ones we have in Europe, among a few others. But it's kind of old now, 2008. It has a large sample of both first, second generation Muslims and large samples of natives, and that large survey was basically the first one to actually measure a lot of different outcomes for immigrant minorities in France. I mean, you may or may not know, it's been a contentious topic, and whether or not we can gather ethnic statistics in France that goes against the credo of republicanism in the country. But that survey filled a historical hole. But so it's kind of old, but it's very good and very granular. So for what we have to do today, it's very, very helpful. The natives are, that's a traditional definition that's used in survey data. It's like the third plus generation. So those in that case who are French-born or French-born parents, right? So that doesn't mean that their grandparents or great-grandparents were not immigrants, but we just don't consider that an immigration background. The religious background for Muslim individuals is self-identified. And finally, in terms of measurement for religiosity, look at 4 dimensions, and I'm going to be using both aggregate measures and separate analyses for each of these dimensions. But one measure is subjective religiosity. How important is religion in your personal life? Another measure is the following of dietary constraints, and how often do you follow the constraints imposed by your religion? Wearing of a religious sign in terms of frequency, and frequency of religious attendance. In that case, religious service. Okay, so I use these 4 dimensions. That's the main outcome I'm looking at in the study. And to operationalize and measure things, income, we have actually really good income data in the survey. So that's the key thing for material insecurity hypothesis, as well as a self-reported measure of material security. Whether or not the respondent felt like he or she has been discriminated against in the past 5 years, as well as a more general question around perception of discrimination. Socialization, religious socialization from parents is measured with the question of the importance of religion when growing up. Then we have a binary measurement, on transnational ties and whether or not the respondent maintained relationship with families and friends in the country of origin, or a parental country in that case. And for replenishment, here we have access to census data on neighborhood composition, and whether or not the respondent lives in a neighborhood that's in the top decile for presence of immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, which are all, those the particular countries I build that measurement for are all Muslim majority countries. Okay. And so again, the first step of that procedure is to identify heterogeneity in the native populations. And here this is done through fuzzy clustering, which on these 6 variables. So gender, age, education, income, urbanicity, or whether or not the respondent lives in a city, and proportion on working a job. And using this data partitioning algorithm on that portion of the data, the natives, we see that the natives are made up of 4 large subgroups. And here, of course, the labels are my own interpretation, but it's really about social class. And you can see that with strong variation in terms of education and income, but also city. So city is not, traditionally not straightforward, of course, class measurement, but it participates in this sort of heterogeneity of the population. And so those are 4 clearly differentiated subgroups, and I've tried other things as well to check on the robustness and whether or not that's a sort of artifact of a technique used here and, previous version of his paper, but, Victor has seen use different techniques, and always these four subgroups sort of emerge from the data. And so here it doesn't round up to round numbers simply because it's an iterative procedure, and we use we assign the respondents multiple times. Okay, so those are averages across assignments. I'm again happy to talk more about this in more detail, but I think it's it's not of central importance for now. And looking at again the native population, the average religiosity. So there's two things here. I mean, first, there's a fair bit of consensus in the population. I mean, that's so here I've aggregated these 4 dimensions on an 8-point scale. Oh, sorry, 9-point scale, because run from 0 to 8. But it's all fairly close together, even though there's some level of difference. But I think the key thing here is that, of course, that still affects the extent of difference, right? And from the Muslim minorities, right? Because if most of them are focused on the social independent subgroup, they might be more heterodox than if they are in the working class group, for instance. And after matching the Muslim respondents to a subgroup of reference, we obtain that average assignment. And so what we see here, and I think the key takeaway here is that again we traditionally using averages and not looking at really that heterogeneity really loses a lot of the complexity of the picture. So as one would have expected, if one knew the context, most respondents are in sort of rather disadvantaged categories, but there's a really healthy and lively upper middle class. Sorry, I shouldn't say upper middle class. Some members of that group are upper middle class, but at least an urban middle class plus. And in fact, in other work in progress, I've also explored that with interviews and so on and so forth. But basically there's a lot of heterogeneity in the population. And looking at the religiosity differential, so here there's 2 things I'd like to convey very clearly. So first of all, it's quite substantial, it's quite high. So here we accumulate the dimensions together, and those bars are the net difference from the natives within each group. So the net Muslim native difference. So that difference is quite substantial, it's highly significant, but it's not it's not the same, right? It's not the same across subgroups. In other words, respondents in the urban middle class subgroups are more heterodox in their level of religiosity. And so that's the aggregate analysis, or sorry, result. And when you decompose it according to a different dimension I measured, so you see that that's not accounted for by difference in the propensity to wear a religious sign, which came to me as a surprise, because of course that's always the way we talk about this in public space and in public debates. And some of you may be aware there's decades of controversies around wearing the veil in France, for example. But that's really not where that difference is. Part of it has to do with subjective religiosity. So Muslim respondents across the board, regardless of which subgroups they're in, are consistently more likely to say that religion is important to them compared to natives. So that's one dimension and one source of a differential. And the second has to do with the respect of dietary constraints. And of course here, I used to have some concern that this was not a fact of a survey, because not all religion have strong dietary constraint restrictions, of course. But I'll talk more about this in a minute. But it certainly is something where like the Muslim minorities stand out. And finally, religious attendance here, there's very little difference as well. So again, in spite of all the controversies on mosque building and so on and so forth, it's really not a dimension where like they stand out. So there's 2 sources. One, respect of dietary constraints, religiously imposed dietary constraints, and subjective religiosity as sources of this sort of aggregate difference. And so what I do now is to test our hypothesis with respect to the 2 dimensions where there's most difference. So I'm not looking at attendance and wearing a religious sign anymore from that point, but just testing our hypothesis with respect to these 2 other dimensions. So that's like, I do those weaving groups analyses. And so here, so I'm going to be describing some level of detail the coefficients, but what I'm most interested is really to compare those subgroups. And so I'm going to be explaining it quite hopefully clearly and carefully. So I'm going to be showing coefficients, which are simple fixed size graphs from the regression models to test the hypotheses, and I'm comparing a pool coefficients where like you put all the measurem respondents in one group, so the traditional nominal group approach, as I called it before, with this subgroup specific approach. And if you, again, so those models have like all the variables used to test hypothesis and a bunch of controls that are, not of immediate interest to me here, but need to be included. And so with all of this in the model, like and that it also includes Catholic respondents that are immigrants, we see that the measurem stand out on aggregate. They do stand out, and that's quite substantial because it runs from 0 to 2. It's a fairly short scale, so they stand out by 0.2 or so, slightly more. But so what's important is that actually this is really carried by 2 groups out of 4, and that's important because that directly conditions whether or not we could say that there's a sort of residual level of difference that's unexplained, right? And of course, it's somewhat political because that really has to do with whether or not measurements are different from of groups. So in that case, we see that the differential, the unexplained differential after all the controls are introduced, is really related to 2 groups, in that particular case, socially dependent and the urban middle class. So in other words, the working class and the peripheral petit bourgeoisie Muslims are not different from the natives and the other groups once everything else is accounted for. And so now switching to hypothesis testing and relating to the measurements I introduced before, we find some degree of support for most of these explanations to a relative degree, and that varies across subgroups. But we find that incomes in the expected direction, inversely related to religiosity, somewhat strangely. And I've quite tried to explain that, but the subjective hardship measurement goes in the opposite direction. But afterwards, it's again with some degree of variation across all these subgroups, goes somewhat in the expected directions or under the mechanisms explained before. So yeah, discrimination matters, socialization matters, and to give you a sense of why it's interesting to look at heterogeneity. I mean, for example, on parental religious socialization, there's much work that shows that it's perhaps the most powerful factor in shaping high religiosity. But what I show here is that it matters. It doesn't matter across the board with the same magnitude. And here it's really, well, it's not really about magnitude. It's really about significance. But basically, in some subgroups, it doesn't matter that much. Or at least, to be precise, socialization matters, but it matters across the board, not just among Muslim respondents in the survey. Transnational ties, yeah, not so much, although it does for the other dimensions. So that's subjective religiosity, and it matters more for dietary constraints. But I won't be spending too much time on this other dimension, in the interest of time and clarity. But yeah, we also see that that neighborhood composition has an impact in the expected direction, and that those who live in neighborhoods with a high proportion, so the top decile of immigrants from North and Sub-Saharan, well, more North and Sub-Saharan Africa, but they also have higher religiosity on average. And to sort of illustrate the collective weight of these variables, I find it's always sort of helpful to compute predicted values and look at how they shift. And so here I'm just showing difference between 2 profiles, like one with a higher religiosity profile, where I condition all the independent variables on high predictive values. So for example, low income, high parental religious socialization, and so on and so forth. And the low profile, I'll do the opposite. And we see that yeah, those variables collectively do quite a lot of work, and that in the low profile, basically, we reach the native levels, the red line. Of course, you know, parental socialization matters a lot, perhaps a lot more than the other variables, but yeah, collectively, it accounts for a lot of what's going on. So that was for subjective religiosity. And so here, I'm just going to show you the predicted values for dietary constraints. I'm not showing you the full models with all the effect size, but something roughly similar is going on. And so decomposing this in terms of percentage, and you know, thinking which dimensions have to do with this idea of cultural import, high religiosity as a cultural import from the country of origin, and which have to do with high religiosity as an endogenous creation of a context of reception due to inequality and social closure. We see that. So basically, and that's pulling all of Muslim response together, both first and second generation. We see that most of it has to do with import, the large majority, but the sizable share has to do with variables measuring dynamics of closure and stratification in the context of reception in France. And of course, quite logically, if you just isolate the second generation response, you see that, you know, it's more balanced. It has to do more with the context of reception, by around 40% on average across subgroups. And so substantively, what that means is that, so here I'm going to sort of, you know, step out from the data aspect and just, you know, back to the sort of, you know, substantive storytelling, as it were. So the first result from the study is that, yeah, so there's two main sources of religiosity differential: higher subjective religiosity on one hand, and falling of dietary constraints on another. That cultural difference is heterogeneous across subgroups, and again, that's important to mention because not once everything is accounted for, not every subgroups within the Muslim population is culturally heterodox. Namely, so in that particular case, it's mostly the middle class group and the socially dependent subgroups, which are truly different. And again, we saw, I hope it was clear, that the pooled analysis, the nominal group approach, really yields average coefficients which hide a lot of heterogeneity. And again, that matters to be able to say whether or not Muslims are different, right? So if you could take a pool approach, it's, you know, it changes things. So again, to be clear, nothing is causal here, but I mean, generally speaking, I do think that the different, you know, different hypotheses and the weight, the variation they contribute to explain is quite interesting, and account for quite a bit of what's going on. And so I think the overall picture and the way I interpret the results is that I think we can think of this religiosity differential as a result of a negative cultural equilibrium, which is an idea I partly stole from David Layton and his colleagues also working on Islamophobia in France, which basically starts with, like, you know, high religiosity and as stemming from just difference between countries, so pre-migration cultural difference, which are imported then in the context of reception, which is marked by inequality and a specific mode of entry into France. I mean, here you have to remember that most Muslim families come from fairly humble social backgrounds. They came as mostly guest workers. I mean, you know, it's an old-fashioned term, but basically they're not supposed to stay, and it so happened that they stayed. Most of them end up staying almost against their wish because of the first oil crisis. I mean, there's a whole historical context, but, you know, I wish I had more time to specify. But basically, there were, like, you know, it was not so well planned, and that's why, you know, we ended up with suburbs in France, for example, with high levels of segregation. But I think my point is to say that this inequality was a condition for further difference, and sort of contributed to maintain, if not reproduce, that difference. And so, and then it maintains it in this sort of endogenous way. So a negative equilibrium simply because it participates in the marginalization of these populations. So of course, as I've said multiple times, key limitation here is that a lot of these processes are heavily dynamic and unfold over time, and there's no way I could really study that fully with the data we have here. Although I'm hopeful because now there's the TO2 survey coming out, hopefully in the next couple of years, which should enable us to do more of that because it's linked across generation. So yes, I hope it was a lot to take in. I hope it made somewhat sense. And if there's clarification or question needed, happy to take in. It should come out now. I mean, the AGS is very slow, but should come out in the January issue of the AGS, which should be out in March. So if anything's really unclear, hopefully the paper does a good job of explaining things. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you for the excellent presentation, Lucas. And there were many questions to ask, and I can see that the paper has very much sharpened up since you last presented at your defense exam.
That's right, yeah.
Obviously, but the theme is there, and you just fine-tune the analysis. And I'm very encouraged by. And in fact, I will read your paper carefully because I'm now involved in a cross-sectional study with data set that's really excellent, but it's just cross-sectional. And it's a study of gender inequality in the knowledge economy, the tech economy in the United States. And that really shows very, very interesting patterns. But I think listening to your paper really gave me ideas about how one can do inferences with a cross-sectional data set very, very effectively. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And so we're open to questions, but I just want to use my introductory position to ask the first question. Now, the question that comes to mind is, to what extent is Muslim religious identity also an ethnic identity? We think of, for example, and this is another way to think about it. Imagine that we did a study in the 1970s, cross-sectional studies of European French Jews, and we would find a large part of the religious identity, I imagine, to be there between the generations. And so it is in part a reflection of the importance of the Jewish faith, but also it is part of an ethnic identity, which is tied to the religious belief. So is this something that would, how would you think of, is this something that we should take into account in thinking of your excellent paper?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Yeah, I think, well, I mean, it's also sort of out of my area of expertise to an extent. I mean, there's one thing I think where Islam is peculiar is that it's very, compared to certainly Judaism, is that conversion is very easy. I mean, it's quite open to outsiders. I think the difference here is that in the case of these populations, religion is overlaid with other types of social difference. I mean, of course, race being an obvious one. I mean, there's all sorts of work on the racialization of religion. I mean, I don't find that's always 100% convincing, but there's something to be said for the fact that in those contexts, such as the French context, but also I would say where I'm living now in Germany, yeah, it's those dynamics of marginalization involving religion may also involve race. I mean, the trick is really to differentiate between them, and identification is very, very complicated. So I don't know. It's a big picture question, and what you asked. But certainly, I would say that if it's not so closely aligned in the country of origin, it sort of becomes aligned with ethnicity simply as a result of this overlap and the way ordinary people perceive Islam as being, this thing from racial minorities. So it's tricky to answer, but it certainly is to an extent, yes.
Okay, well, let's open the floor to questions. And I think you know quite a few of the people in the audience. And
I do, yeah, which makes me smile.
And so why don't you take the questions, Lucas?
Okay, London?
Yes, thank you. I really enjoyed this talk. I think,
Thank you.
I am always happy to see someone studying religion using strong empirical methods, because I feel like that sometimes doesn't happen. So I really enjoyed hearing about this paper. So I have two questions. One is about basically demography and fertility. In the study of religion, there's this idea, and I guess demography and fertility as well, that more religious people have more kids. So one thing that I'm wondering could happen is that even though the second generation looks more religious than the first generation, what if children are not more religious than their parents? So what could happen is that the most religious immigrants have the most kids. So like imagine a very, very, very religious immigrant having 8 children and a fairly secular immigrant having 1. What could happen then is that children in the second generation could look quite religious, because perhaps there's 8 times as many children born into the most religious families as there are born into the most secular families. So it definitely would not invalidate anything you're doing here, but it's just a possibility and a question and something you could maybe consider in future research. And then my second question was similar to Victor's about, religion. And especially, if we think about Islam in France, it's religion, but it's also ethnicity and it's also culture. And it's an identity that in many ways, there are cultural sociologists starting to say that religion is a culture and that you almost cannot separate that. And then especially with something like Islam or Judaism, there's also ethnicity tied up with the culture and the religion. So one thing I was interested to see here was, the importance of these dietary constraints. And then I'm also then kind of almost wondering, is it possible that following a Muslim or a Jewish dietary constraint could be a cultural or ethnic practice as much as it is specifically religious? And the reason, for me, I asked that in my own sense, because I still follow the dietary practices of the religion I was born in, almost just by momentum, that you start doing it, you get used to doing it, you start to imagine that for some reason it's maybe healthier or better, and then you just keep doing it even if you are no longer part of the religion. So I'm wondering, if that's happening, and then also too, if it's a way for second generation Muslims who might feel like they're losing their identity and it might be kind of precarious. So this happens with Judaism, is the importance of like, how do I maintain a Jewish identity if I am no longer religious? And so I'm wondering, could following Muslim dietary constraints be a way to, kind of reinforce a potentially otherwise perceived to be precarious identity?
Yeah, no, thank you. So that's okay. I'm going to try to be relatively quick. On your last question, yes. I think here there's a lot of qualitative work on this. Interviews with whole families around acculturation and the different meaning of these practices to different people. And I think most of that work tends to document the fact that it's very individualized and different people mean different things when they eat halal and whatnot. So I think that sort of would tend to suggest some kind of sometimes acculturation, because in that case it's kind of individualization and going away from like the group constraint. I don't find that so convincing. Is that in survey data, you see the numbers suggest that there's some intensity left in those practices. So it's very tricky to say exactly. I think it might be promising to more look at like the extent to which they're decoupled. I mean, the extent to which, you know, kind of what you're saying, like maybe some, you know, lots of people just, you know, they are very strict with like the food, but that's just about it, for example. And I think, you know, that remains to be done. I mean, there's probably a few studies here and there, but like there haven't been like a, you know, very strong comprehensive study of the extent of which it's decoupled. So I think that's perfectly possible. I hope I didn't miss too much of your second question. On your first question, fertility, I mean, so what I tried to do here, I was really concerned I would lose people who were secularized and would just stop identifying as Muslims, right? Which basically that would introduce a lot of bias. I mean, there's something I took from most of the US literature on, you know, studying Hispanic origin populations who kind of change their identification to whites as a result of some assimilation processes. So I include some of these people who, you know, report Muslim parents but not being Muslim themselves, and I assign them a 0 score. That doesn't really change much. So I think, you know, in terms of like the fertility and it's, yeah, I think it's, you know, it's probably borne out by the fact that those first generation have more children. I mean, I think that and that's going to be my way to sort of wrap things up with my answer to this question. I think what's really at stake now is really studying the grandchildren of immigrants, because I think they are going to be able to let us adjudicate whether or not, you know, we really have a delayed religious assimilation phenomenon, as, you know, what I'm documenting here suggests, or if it's more like, you know, an attitude thing, but, you know, people in surveys would be like, yeah, of course, you know, like, I mean, it's my religious heritage is very important, and I answer from an effective point of view to this question. And, you know, of course, I would say it's very important to me, that religion, even though, you know, I don't do, in practice, some people don't do much. So, I mean, it's, you know, it's very, very tricky. So I think, you know, my answer would be wait and see, and we'll be able to see, I think. And there's data coming out right now, and I'm part of a recently funded research big project on the grandchildren of immigrants. So hopefully, you know, in the next 2 years, we'll be able to see.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, Radu, yeah. Oh, you're muted. I can't hear you.
Better?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for that talk. I really like the fact that you're breaking up the little groups and not taking the global average, because when you have just the groups all together, it's like a bundle. It's just a crypto-fascist approach, and this is really breaking it down. So good. My question was, and this is not, this is going forward from the paper. I don't think you're talking about this in the paper. It's that the interaction between the two groups that you found that are most important, which is the urban middle class and the dependent group.
Yep.
I'm thinking just of what I've seen of immigrant religiosity as an Orthodox Christian in North America, what you tend to have is your first wave of big immigrants, but and then the differentiation that you mentioned, and then it's very important that the richer group starts setting up institutions. They're the ones that can fund seminary students.
Yeah.
They're the ones that can fund newspapers. And they're basically, there's very few of them, but they take the leadership, and especially in terms of clergy. Clergy recruitment among Orthodox in America is almost exclusively from children of clergy and converts. So again, you have this elite group without which the whole rest of the religiosity would really suffer. So I'm just wondering, in the things that you've, if there's any data that can help you pinpoint some interaction between the two groups that you found tended to be more important, or if it's your general sense that there's this kind of leader-follower dynamic between groups, or if it's just more complex than that.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, there's been decades of discussion on how to organize Islam in France, simply because it's, you know, notoriously disorganized as a religion. I mean, that's, you know, the French state has tried and failed to set up, you know, sort of, you know, representative body of like Muslims in France. And yeah, it's very much a work in progress. I mean, there's work. I have a colleague who does work on elite Muslim organization and so on and so forth. But, you know, my sense is that it doesn't stem from that. I mean, I think if it might stem from you know, some most governing bodies, which are up until recently were directly tied to the countries of origin. But yeah, that's, you know, this is unfortunately outside my purview, way outside the data I have here, and I'm just mostly speculating based on the readings I've done. But yeah, you know, I don't have a strict answer to your question, but certainly I don't think it's the elite thing. But that's my sense. Yep.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, Catherine. Yeah. Sorry, did I miss anybody else? I don't think so. Catherine, please.
I think Shelley has a question after.
Oh,
me,
Shelley.
but-
Yeah, Shelley. Sorry, I missed you. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Are we still good? I thought it ends at like 1.
I mean, I have time, but you know.
Okay. So I actually have a question, not necessarily related to the content of your talk, but like how you did your research. I think one of the things that I found fascinating about, especially as like, I think we're graduate students and we're here to be trained, like to do research, is how your paper has like basically been focused on a similar topic, but also has improved so much, maybe in the sense that it's going to appear in AJF since last time I went to your job talk. And it's always like very fascinating to me how, because I'm like going through the same process and I really want like your advice and suggestions. Like I thought I wrote a paper and it's fine. And professors tell me, yeah, it's a good paper. But you know, if you want to go, like if you want to try like ASR, you want to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And then I like, or you get like comments from reviewers, that's also usually a little bit more directed, but especially this kind of, I mean, if I remember correctly, last time you did your job talk was more kind of the cluster analysis part and the heterogeneity part, but not so much the data-driven like new methodology part. But also, I think importantly, I remember very distinctively last time Professor Kim Whedon asked this question about like different hypotheses and how you organize them and something like that. And I
remember that too.
I really want to know how like you grapple with like thinking about an already very actually complete paper to yourself, making it also like even better to other people so that eventually it gets accepted to AJF. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, let me preface whatever I say also by saying that, you know, it's always a crapshoot. I mean, you know, because you need to reach a certain level of quality, but I mean, you know, there's a lot of that's outside of your hand. I mean, this being said, you know, since the job talk, I mean, first of all, that paper was already R&R and it was R&R for a while. I mean, it took me a long while to get the methodology like changed and improved. And I mean, I think as far as Kim's comments, I mean, as I recall, like, I mean, she didn't like the sort of group comparison, and also, well, obviously she didn't like the class analysis, which, you know, I understand because, you know, that's not how real class scholars do. But I mean, I think the idea like a lot of that has not changed. I mean, that stayed the same because I thought it was essential to the paper. Now what's changed is really the methods. I mean, you know, I didn't go into details here, but I think the methods is much better insofar as, you know, when I used like simple k-means as I did before, it's not probabilistic. It's like, you know, observations are assigned in a hard way to a group or another. And here I developed this much more probabilistic and actually iterative approach where, like, you know, you basically assign observations hundreds of times and you average all of your results across. So it's much more, in a way, it's, you know, it's much more elaborate. So I think that's what I've changed most. And if that's something that came out from the reviews, I mean, if they didn't, you know, they didn't suggest to do that or whatever, but they just said like basically like hard clustering reifies subgroups. So like, you know, it's fine to break up groups into subgroups, but you still have, you know, this problem of essentialism with those subgroups, which I thought was a very valid point. And that's one that, you know, got me working for a long while trying to work around it. But, you know, yeah, it's, so I don't, you know, I wish I had more precise advice. I mean, I think we'll have, you know, different experiences and so on, but I think, yeah, especially if you write, my advice, if you write on non-American topic, is to spend a lot of time contextualizing as well, because I think for this generalist journal, I mean, you need to make it interesting in general, but also, you know, to an audience that may not know the specifics of your context. So it's a lot to do in one paper. But anyway, if you have more questions, I'd be happy to talk more in detail if you want. Yeah.
I think Catherine had a question.
Yes, Catherine, please.
Yeah, thanks for giving this talk, and also thank you for all the questions, because these always really get me thinking. I was wondering if you think that similar methods could be used to study the racialization of religion. So either within a given religion or across different religions. Because it seems like these methods could, like these methods or something close to these methods could be used to look at, yeah.
So when you say racialization, what do you have in mind?
I mean, like the identification, the iterative identification between a race and a religion or an ethnicity and a religion, but also the heterogeneity within a religion of different races.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely. I think part of why that paper in the end got accepted is that I think because the methods can be adapted to other issues. I mean, I think it'd be, yeah, if, for example, you know, if you, a thing that you could do with those machine learning approaches is that you can constrain the number of groups that emerge. And then, you know, you could see if those actually naturally match your categories of interest. I mean, that's something that you could do. And then that tells you empirically if your categories of interest are actually the best way to approach the data. So I think in terms of reflexivity and, you know, thinking carefully about your categories of analysis, which is something, again, that, you know, that's been very heavy in the literature for a long while. I mean, for example, I think, you know, part of why, you know, Albani's book, Victor's book on remaking the mainstream, I think a lot of what they did was like, you know, salvage this idea of a mainstream of something being diverse and heterogeneous, and that's not necessarily a white middle class core. So I think those issues around heterogeneity and reflexivity around the categories are very, very salient, but I think, you know, it's much harder to put them into practice, into quantitative practice. And I think machine learning affords a lot to potentially to do that. So that's something to think about, I would say. And that's something I'm planning to do more about and write also more theoretical papers about, but yeah, reflexivity afforded by those approaches, I think it's something that's very promising.
Well, we don't see a hand up. Thank you. We actually have till 1:30, I guess. Am I wrong in thinking that, or is this?
Oh, is that right? Okay, yeah, yeah. I mean, I have more time, so, but no, thanks for all the questions so far.
All right. Well, okay. One more question.
Oh, I just have a very more kind of technical question on your slides.
Yep.
There was a slide on, maybe you can share the screen again, like the step 1 of that method where there were a bunch of numbers that were presented. I didn't really know what the numbers meant.
Oh, yeah.
Like the cluster analysis, like there's a table and then there's a bunch of numbers. Are they like what, like t-statistic or?
Can you see that?
Yeah, yeah, that one. Yes.
Yeah, so those are just averages for these dimensions by the subgroups.
Oh, okay, I see.
And they're all pretty different. I mean, I ran the t-statistics on one iteration, but yeah, they're all fairly differentiated. But I mean, I chose to sort of show those dimensions more because I think they're the more important in sort of, interpreting the groups. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty typical. That's something Philis does. For example, in her book, I did in an earlier iteration to use t-statistics as a way to sort of validate your typology by showing that the groups are different on most dimensions. Yeah.
And the counts are not whole numbers because this is weighted, or? No,
that's because basically those results are averages over 500 iterations. So because it's a big the memberships are uncertain, right? And approaches like fuzzy clustering, but also latent class analysis, they give you a way to basically assign at random based on the probability of belonging. So I mean, what I did here is that basically you do hundreds of assignments, and then you run the regression 500 times, and that gives you sort of Monte Carlo standard errors. And so here, the counts are not round simply because there's slight variation across membership in each iteration. Yep, does that make sense?
Okay. And what about slides 34?
Yeah.
Yeah. What are those first gen or second gen? And are these also just out of assignment, or are they
Yeah.
What exactly do these like percentages mean?
Yeah. So those are the basically the relative share amongst, for example, this is the relative share in the second generation that belongs to these groups. And so those are again the average over 500 iterations. So that's sort of the average you get in terms of group membership. So and those are matched, right? So they matched over the native. So you get the natives segments, and then you match like any kind of immigrants you want, immigrant groups based on the social similarity and social proximity.
Okay, so just to understand the background of this, are these like working class to like socially dependent groups emerging from your classification, or are those?
That's right. No, that's right.
What kind of data do we initially have? We know nothing about the groups.
I mean, I think a choice in that approach, the crucial choice is what they include here on the left column. So here I chose like those socio-demographics or structural variables, but that's really where the crucial choice emerges, because afterwards it's up to data. Yeah, does that make sense?
Okay, and then they tell you there are 4 groups.
That's like, right. Yeah, 4. So 4 was the best number. I mean, there's like, I'm not a huge fan of these indices, but yeah.
I see.
Can you see that? Yeah. So there's all sorts of heuristics you can use and diagnostic tests to determine the best number of clusters. I think, at the end of the day, what matters most is that they make sense to an extent. If they're totally nonsensical, even though like, the tests tell you that you should pick up that particular way to slice the data, we should be careful. So anyways, here it's like some say 4, some say 5, but it's a matter of like, there's other guidelines to choose, I think, besides those tests. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Well, okay, we have
thanks for
had a wonderful presentation, very rich and very encouraging to your audience, many of whom are graduate students, and what can be done in the Cornell graduate program. And so
that's right.
It's great to see you again by Zoom. And
yes, thanks, Victor, for invitation. And yeah, hopefully I can swing by the department, who knows when, but sooner rather than later, and we could catch up.
I should add that Lucas is a research fellow of the Center for the Study of Economy and Society.
That's true. Yeah, that's right.
We are building up the fellows and research fellows program, and we will provide funding for travel to Ithaca to our research fellows and fellows. And the newest fellow to join the center is Woody Powell. I was very pleased that he was very, he said, honored to be part of our center. And Lucas has presented in what I call the Big Tent version of the Center for the Study of Economy and Society. The center was named after Max Weber's 2-volume book, Economy and Society. A key part of that was economic sociology, which we have a series to focus on. But the Big Tent included ethnicity, religion, authority, power, bureaucracy, a whole range of central core questions and ideas that shaped modern sociology in the West. So you're welcome to write to me with suggestions of people who we ought to invite, not this year so much, but next year, to be presenting to either the Big Tent version of the center or the focal theme and questions that are in economic sociology.
Yeah, and by the way, I should say that the map I showed of like this other paper I published was also presented that to the CSES years ago, and actually the CSES funded my initial research trip to gather the data. So very good.
Yes, I do take some credit to
you can take some credit, yeah.
Shift you away from doing immigration research in North America, which was already crowded, and said, well, what about Europe? What about going to spend time in Paris and meet the Paris scholars? So that was a fateful shift to Western Europe. And the paper we wrote for the annual review was a study, one of the first that really looked closely at the literature on immigration and assimilation, second generation for the United States and Western Europe. And it turns out there's surprising similarities in both regions.
I think so. I think it's there's more than we think. I think that's a point. Yeah, I mean there's some differences, but the more I think about this, the more I think the basics of assimilation are similar. That's something I want to keep actually writing about.
Good. Okay, good. Take care. Stay safe.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Hopefully see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.